Hello and welcome to The Future is Spoken, produced by the Digital Assistant Academy. This show accompanies the Digital Assistant Academy's course entitled Voice Interaction Design. Text-to-speech engines has existed for many decades with assistive technologies like screen readers to empower people with disability. With the evolution of voice assistants, there has been a significant shift in the desire to have a more natural-sounding synthetic text-to-speech voices. There are many companies pushing boundaries to make natural-sounding synthetic voices, and VocaliD is one of them. In today's natural-sounding synthetic voices episode, Shyamala Praga speaks with Rupal Patel on these very aspects. Rupal is founder and CEO of VocaliD, a synthetic media company that creates unique vocal personalities for applications that talk. VocaliD is a spin-out from Patel's lab at Northeastern University, where she is tenured professor. A native of Canada, Rupal began her career as a speech clinician and subsequently earned her doctorate in speech science from University of Toronto and postdoctoral training at MIT. A consummate advocate for accessibility and ethical AI, Rupal is passionate about voice AI and its potential to unite us and build lasting relationships. She was recently named one of Fast Company's 100 most creative people in business, and her work has been featured on TED, NPR, and in leading news and technology outlets such as The Wall Street Journal, BBC, Wired, Bloomberg, and BuzzFeed. Enjoy the show.
Welcome to The Future is Spoken, and in today's episode, I have a very special guest from VocaliD, Rupal Patel. Rupal is the CEO of VocaliD, who works on synthetic voices.
That's right.
Yeah, welcome, Rupal.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here, Himala.
Yeah, likewise. So can you tell our audience a little bit about yourself?
Yes, so I am by trade a speech scientist. I have a faculty appointment at Northeastern University in Boston, and I spun out a technology from my lab in 2015 called VocaliD. And what we do is we make customized synthetic voices for individuals as well as for companies. We actually started with a mission to create voices for people who couldn't speak and have their voice sound more like it was fitting for who they are, whether they lost their voice or whether they never had a voice to begin with and had to use a synthetic voice to communicate.
That's interesting. Actually, the use case was completely different than the use cases now you have, right? Like you started to enable people who have any kind of speech limitations. And from there to now, where VocaliD does a lot more than just enabling the synthetic voices for people with disabilities, but now you can have text-to-speech anywhere and everywhere. So could you talk a little bit more about, all the different product lines and what VocaliD does there?
Yes. Yeah, I think that the core technology is really, it's text-to-speech, right? And I think until more recently, it was very difficult to make a text-to-speech engine that was unique sounding because it took so much effort and time to create each of the voices. So with the new machine learning algorithms that are out there now, there's just a capability to create these voices more at scale. So what we started seeing is as our technology became more and more human sounding and more natural sounding, we saw applications beyond assistive technology. Primarily, if you think about the voice first interface right now, the demand for voice is just skyrocketing. So every piece of content now that we used to maybe read with our eyeballs, we're reading or listening to with our ears, right? And how do you create that much content that quickly that is convincing sounding? Of course, you can have human actors that read out loud this content, but that's actually time consuming. There's a lot of friction in that in terms of getting people back to even read like little bits of audio. So what we're doing is enabling that to be customized still, like it could be unique voices. So you don't want to just use an Alexa voice or a Google voice to read out loud, content that's about your brand. So we make that customized to the brand. You can think about this in a number of different verticals. You can think about it with short marketing content where you do want to have a unique voice saying that or your own brand voice saying that. Could be customer support, outbound calling. It could also be more specific applications that are a lot more about social connection. So our goal is to use voice as that social connector and to be able to do that at scale.
So you started as a speech scientist, right? And then started your own company. So everyone, when they start their company, obviously it comes through some problem. So was there any such problem which you identified when you thought like, okay, I have to create VocaliD because this is the XYZ problem? Because you mentioned assistive technologies, right? So
Right.
can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So my research primarily had been with people who were non-speaking or who had very limited speech motor control. And we, in my laboratory, would build different kinds of applications to help them communicate more efficiently and also more effectively. And one of the projects was VocaliD, because even if you don't have a voice, there's most of those people at that time, this is back in 2007 is when the project really started in the laboratory. There were very limited voice options on their assistive technologies. And what we saw in the work that I was doing is that people with limited speech capabilities still had the ability to control something called the prosody of their voice, the changes in pitch, loudness, duration, those kinds of things. And those have information bearing cues in them. So it helps you identify an individual by just even their vocalizations. Even if you don't know what they're saying, you know who it is that's talking, right? Think about a severely accented person. Even when we first hear them, we don't understand what they say, but we know that they're different than the next person. So the insight for VocaliD was basically to say, well, if they're all using the same, or similar sounding voices, yet they have a unique sound to their own voice, can't we make a better sounding match for the voice that comes out of their speaking box? Because what happens with assistive technology is that assistive communication devices is that often you have these devices, but people still want to vocalize. Vocalization is just such a natural way of communicating. And so if the voice coming out of that box can sound more like them, or at least sound more unique, there's ownership over that device. And so, and over their own voice, right? And that is an important piece to getting these individuals to communicate more and more with unfamiliar individuals and all of that. So that was really the spark for us to, how do we make a voice that's unique? And that's hard because these people didn't have enough voice to contribute to create a synthetic voice for them. So the idea was to take everyday people like you and I who can record a few hours of speech and to morph the samples of the individual who can't speak with the speech donor, let's call them, and create a new data set that will then be used to create a synthetic voice that matches them more appropriately.
Wow, it's fascinating. I love the story. Definitely, a lot in there. So Rupal, and this is not just for assistive technologies anymore, like you mentioned, it can be used everywhere and anywhere. Now we have all these voice assistants like Alexa, Siri, Google Assistant, the one in the car as well. And as the use cases evolve, of course, people just don't want a robotic voice anymore. For their assistant, they want more natural sounding voice. So I feel like that's where, the need for synthetic voices or more natural sounding voices will be more, right? What does it take? Like one of the things you mentioned was the voice samples itself, right? But what does it take to create a natural sounding voice to that extent where it's like we talking?
Yeah. So I think that the one thing about the way that we create synthetic voices today is that we have people read content. And then that content is used, the audio samples as well as the transcript of those audio samples is used to train the speech engine. Now, read speech is very different than spoken speech. What you and I are doing today is a much more natural kind of speaking dialogue, right? There's ums and ahs, there's hesitations, there's pauses. These are different than if I were reading some content. So one of the trickiest things is we want natural speech when we want our devices to talk to us, because they're not reading out loud to us. They're, quote, speaking to us, right, in conversation. So if the input is read speech, then the way it's going to sound is like it's being read out loud to you. So the tricky part is, how do you get it to be more conversational, yet still be high enough quality for building a synthetic voice? You can't really have a synthetic voice being built on low quality audio, because when you're trying to model the audio or the speech signal, you're also modeling everything else about the ambient and noise environment, right? So that's the trickiest part, I think, in doing this. But now with content like yours, like your podcast, like you're starting to get clean audio, if there are ways to automate getting more natural content and annotating that so we can sort of scale this, I think that there's some really interesting possibilities of how we can get more toward more natural sounding speech.
Yeah, definitely. it feels like it is a lot of effort just by looking at the recordings and going through those, training the system. How much data are we talking about? Like, do you need tons of data, thousands of data in order to train a natural sounding voice?
Yeah, so here's the tricky thing, right? Like you can train a voice with any amount of data, right? So oftentimes what we're doing is we have a universal model or an already built voice that sort of speaks like English, right? And then when we want to make a voice sound more like Shamala, we would ask you to speak a little bit more or ask you to produce the speech and then adapt that model. So we were able to get that down to around 90 minutes of recorded audio. If you do it with less, it'll sound less like you and less natural. You can get the sounds right with less speech in terms of what the consonants and vowels sound like. That's not the issue. It's really what is the characteristics about your voice that are unique? What's the rhythm of your voice? What's the cadence of your voice? What's the accent? All of the voice quality. These things, you need a little bit more sampling of the data to kind of get to a point where it really sounds like you. There is an asymptote value here, like right after some amount of speech, you don't need tens of hours of speech, which you used to have to do. Like if you think about the way that Siri and Alexa and so on were built with the concatenative models of speech synthesis, a lot more speech was necessary for that than is necessary in today's models.
Right. Yeah. So technology is evolving. So definitely there's some benefits which is coming out of that. Like we don't need hours and days. Like I still remember like when we were working on some of the synthetic voices, like the text to speech engine in the past, it was like a 2 years effort just to get a text to speech engine out.
Yeah, because there was a lot of, so when in the concatenative method, you were not only getting all the sounds, but all the sound combinations and all the prosodic elements, meaning, is this rising or falling? Is it a question or a statement? How are you saying this? Because anytime you glue together little bits of speech, if the pitch is off and not aligned, it will actually be much more audible to your ear, even if the sounds are fine. But if the pitch is off, our ears are so attuned to that. And so there was so much speech that had to be collected in order to have all these combinations of the pitch track as well as the auditory samples of the different units of speech production.
So one effort is just the making of these sounds, right? And then the other effort which you're talking about is completely different for anyone to be able to tune the prompt for the pitch or the tone or the speed and all of those things according to their needs or liking. So can you talk a little bit about that part of the text-to-speech engine?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think the newer methods now, the end-to-end synthesis methodologies, allow us to control the speech in a different way. Some of it is in some ways more restricted just because it's not the same as using SSML tags as the past, but there's other ways to kind of superimpose SSML tags into this new methodology. What's interesting is though, we can control style of the voice. You can start to do things like interpolate between different voices so that you kind of have some style modification within the voice. You can, of course, change the pitch of the voice, the loudness, the duration. We've also started implementing in our newest method a way to change at a word level, not at a syllable level, but at a word level, the pitch and the duration of the signal. That actually helps a lot because when we think about linguistic contents, so let's say if you want to stress a word within a sentence, you're going to change its pitch, its loudness, its duration of the vowel, and so on. So this kind of control gives the content producer a lot more flexibility and creativity about how they want the voice to sound or the audio content to sound. The other thing that we're doing, which I'm really excited about, is some of the style modifications. So thinking about, my expertise has been in prosody, and prosody is really what we call the melody of speech, right? That's what leads to naturalness. Like when you listen to somebody who doesn't sound natural to you, often it's not because they don't pronounce the sounds accurately, it's because the melody's off, the cadence is off. Second language learners, for example, typically don't pause at the right times. And when they don't, or they elongate the wrong syllable, that's what leads to the unnaturalness of the voice or the change in standard of the voice.
Interesting. So this is an interesting point. So now what comes to my mind is like when you are designing these things, do you look for bilingual or trilingual or like monolingual people? Because now again, I can speak three different languages, Hindi, Telugu, and English, right? But then, I mean, of course, my Hindi has screwed up now. So if you were to train a model with a person with three different languages, do you see any such things like monolingual will give you a better quality or like a bilingual will?
So the thing is, typically you're training with a English, like a monolingual English speaker, because when you speak multiple languages, you actually, the melody of each of those languages is different, right? And that's going to change the way you speak any of the languages that you speak. So typically it's been that way that people are choosing monolingual speakers. We've decided at VocaliD that actually the colorfulness of English comes in all of those accents. And we find that that actually adds that more diversity to the voice and more intrigue to the voice. Now, that was the thesis. Whether or not product designers are ready for that is kind of another question. So initially we had thought that, think about voices today, it's a pretty monochromatic kind of landscape, right? Yet, if you look at all the movements that are happening about diversity, about inclusion, we're not seeing that in products and services today. So I think that we're early along those lines to be thinking about these things, but I can't imagine that consumers are going to be okay with monochromatic for too much longer.
Wow. So so for example, Alexa or Ford or Google, they are like global brands, right? And they have products across. So if someone was to design a text to speech, like a voice assistant, for example, like Alexa is everywhere. And if you see Alexa's voice, I mean, the same voice you would find everywhere else, except, maybe if there were like Hindi or some additional languages out there, maybe there might be a different voice. So do you feel like people are open to having different voices from the same assistant depending on the region, or because they get used to a certain voice, they would expect the same voice all over?
Yeah, I actually think big brands have this notion that they have to have an Uber voice, like a voice that is the voice for their whole brand. But their customers, their consumers are not one monolithic group. They have different preferences. They are in different geographies. It's not just about the geography, but if you think about even something as simple as fast talkers like to listen to fast talkers. They are really irritated by slow talkers, right? Extroverted people like extroverted voices. Like there is no preferences of voice. And yet product designers, I think part of this is because up until now, to make a synthetic voice, as you said, has been a 2-year expedition, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars. And so they're stuck in this, well, we can only have one voice. But if you look at any kind of technology, personalization always wins. Initially, Ford made only black cars, right? And then after that, people asked for diversity, right? And now you see all sorts of colors of cars, even some that are quite ugly, but people like them, right? This is similar to voice, is how it doesn't necessarily have to be a completely different voice in another region, but think about the adaptation that can be done. The same speaker, you and I speak today in a certain kind of a voice to one another. When I'm speaking to my kids, I might speak differently. When I speak to my parents, I might speak differently. So we change our voices, right? There could be variations of style differences even for these voices, and slight even accent differences. If you speak another language, sometimes when you go back to your country and when you're speaking even English or that other language, you kind of adapt the way you speak. So those changes that happen more naturally, I think those can also be done in products. I don't think we need to think about completely new identities, but we can think about the subtle differences. And I think that will be a way that brands really connect with their consumers to say, we hear you, we know you're not monolithic, we know you have different preferences, and we give you choice. We're not it's not top down, it's more this bottom up thing. And frankly, there's gonna have to be differentiation, because if all brands are kind of just gravitating to this, or everything that Alexa puts out, or every product, is sort of similar sounding, it sort of lacks an identity of its own.
I love that. Yeah. And that definitely reminds me how every time we go to India, my son tries to actually make the Indian accent so that people can understand him. For sure. So yeah, that's so true. And I love your notion of why can't we adapt the same kind of things into the product and make it more personalized for the users? Because then I definitely feel there will be more ongoing utility. People would want to use it more and more. So why do you think, Rupal, that natural sounding voice is so important nowadays?
Oh, because like I said earlier, I mean, I think that almost every way that we're consuming information these days is through our ears. We have so much information that is being produced that's audible. And now we've gotten to, it's kind of like with the mobile phone. First came the phone and the hardware, and then after that we had all these apps, right? All these different ways that you could use this device, and from everything from just, it wasn't just a phone, it wasn't just a calculator, it's so much more. I think similarly now with headless devices out there, and also things like your car, and your phone, there's so much audible capability today that you need to have voice, but it can't just be robotic voice. And I think the main thing is we're still in a phase where voice is being used as an information delivery system. It's just all about bits of information being transferred to the end user. But I think when we start thinking about voice being used for social connection, right? Let's say you have books that are read out loud to your child in your voice. You have healthcare apps that are in the voice of the physician or loved ones for patients with dementia. Voice is not just informational in that way. Voice is connection in that way. And so if it's not natural sounding, and if it doesn't evoke a feeling, then it's just a signal. But voice is far more powerful than a signal. It is an emotion. It's a feeling. And that is, I think, really vital. It needs to sound natural for that.
Yeah, I mean, you brought up really good use cases, and that really makes me think like it's not just like a transactional robot for you anymore, but it has more things to do, or it can enable more and more people with more and more use cases, which is really nice. So, Rupal, if someone wants to get into the space and want to design the natural sounding voices or be in the text to speech world, what kind of skill sets should they be having?
So that's the beauty. I think text to speech for so long had sort of they had sort of flattened out. There was not much work being done in it because it was sort of good enough. And now we're looking, if you've also already asked, like, how do you make it sound more natural? What do we have to do to create scenarios of data collection that are more natural, right? So I think linguistics is an interesting skill set or a background to come to this for. Of course, machine learning is an obvious one just because most of the new methodologies are machine learning based. The other thing too is psychology backgrounds, because we're doing some experiments right now about not just building the voices, but also trying to figure out how people perceive them. So there's literature out there to say women like these kinds of voices, men like these kinds of voices, older people like these kinds of voices. But we don't have very specific information like, okay, women like these kinds of voices for, a healthcare application, or certain people in a demographic, like 20 to 30-year-olds really like this particular kind of voice quality for a motivational app, right? If we understood that, then I think from the product design phase or aspect, you can figure out what kind of voice needs to be part of your product. So I think that's where psychology and listener perception comes into play. So I think there's a number of different skill sets and a number of different kinds of training that could be useful in this whole area. So regardless, first is some basic skills, but then after that is just a passion to learn and kind of apply your skills toward this area.
Yeah, definitely. It's a fascinating world to be in, for sure. Especially with the world of voice assistant, where everyone wants a voice app nowadays. Of course, conversational AI is a big thing, right? We can apply to chatbots, but then chatbots doesn't have the same thing. But nowadays, I've also started seeing where chatbots also have a voice so that they can be enabled for more and more people.
Yeah.
Especially for the accessibility. So maybe it could be applied even there. So yeah, linguistics, I think, is becoming a very, very hot field all of a sudden.
Yeah. Yeah. It got canceled out of, I think so many linguistics programs were eliminated from college programs. And they became sort of minors as opposed to majors, but we're sort of seeing a rebirth in that. Speech science, I think also signal processing. So here's the thing is the technology will probably get you about 90% of the way there in terms of what the voice can do and how you can generate an artificial voice that maybe sounds natural. But the last 10% is likely going to be some kind of art, right? So whether you're an audio designer or have some signal processing skills to actually add a level of naturalness to it, if you can blend the right kind of music with it, right? So you can think about, we rarely ever listen to audio alone, like flat, what's called dry audio, right? If you listen to the radio, for example, no one's is just talking. There's always something in the background, right? And so that is also interesting to think about. Maybe it isn't just the synthetic voice that has to do all the work. It's the combination of that plus the right music, plus the right audio enhancement. All of those, I think, are also going to add to the pleasantness of the voice and the enjoyability of the voice.
Yeah, definitely. So does your team do any kind of research, and how do you even test it out? Like, okay, I've designed this voice and now I need to make sure like people are perceiving it the way we want it to perceive and things like that.
Yeah, we do. I mean, we have a very sort of skewed toward the R&D side kind of a company at the moment, especially given the kind of funding that we've had. So in addition, like I said, to doing the experiments on building out the voices and making them sound more natural, and also implementing newer techniques on the vocoding side, we are doing these listener perception experiments to understand how consumers and how individuals have different preferences for voice, and that those preferences are not like are written in stone. They actually vary by context, meaning I might like a certain kind of a voice to give me information that's just sort of reading the weather or something mundane like that. But when it comes to a much more socially based task, that voice might have to do something different, right? And that's informative because it helps us understand how we need to be able to control and vary the voices that we build. So they go hand in hand with one another.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, research, I think, is definitely an important aspect of everything for sure. So tell me about this thing, like when you are testing out a sound or when you're designing the sound, it might be completely different, right? Because when you're doing it locally or maybe in your own world. Now, when you start deploying it into different devices, for example, if you were to deploy something in the cloud or something embedded in the vehicle, of course, the quality changes, right? How do you ensure that it's not too much of a quality difference when it comes to all of these different implementations?
Yeah, that's really tough. I think we learned that lesson really well when we were building out the voices for people with assistive technology needs, because typically the devices on which they're using these voices are older generation technology, and they're not really the most sophisticated speakers, right? And so you've got the speaker on the back of the device and it's buried, in someone's lap or on a wheelchair or something like that. And it does make a difference. Even like the loudness of the voice was really soft sounding on some of the devices. And what good is a voice if you can't hear it, right? So there is this interaction between our technology and the final hardware that it has to go on. And I think this is where I mean that you have to start becoming creative with the signal processing. You have to start thinking about how do you integrate this to more tighter integration loops. So it's not just like, oh, we've got the voice, it's done, right? You have to have that involved you have to be thinking about that at the beginning, because if you don't, you'll ship something and there'll be so much disappointment with that. We're learning our lessons slowly, I think, around that, because it's been, especially when you think about a core technology like text-to-speech being deployed in multiple different ways, you don't know all the different ways that people are going to use it. And I think that becomes really challenging.
Definitely. I think that's a very, tough problem to solve for. And how does the operating system plays into all of these things?
Yeah, so again, for when we were So right now, when we talk about business customers, most of them are going to be using the voice as a downloadable WAV file or an API call that creates a WAV file or MP3 file. But in the case of the assistive technologies, we actually made embedded voices, and those voices we had to make a Windows-based application to create a Windows wrapper. We had to make an iOS and an Android wrapper, essentially. So those are, being used by hundreds of people now, but that was definitely a challenge. And every time you update a system, especially for iOS and Android, there are always changes and updates that we have to do to our tech stack. The Windows wrapper is nice because it's the SAPI 5.1 protocol, and that works okay. There's no expectations of there being something different there, but it requires not just us doing something, but also the third party of the iOS developer or the Android developer to make sure that the voice continues to work in the new environment. So updates it's just challenging for embedded technologies, but not unsurmountable. That's not rocket science, that's the implementation stage. So it's a pain, but I think that it's an intermediate pain because to me, it feels like we are going to be going to cloud in every dimension. Our cars are connected, everything is connected, our fridges are connected, like everything. So I think this is an intermediary space where we are thinking about hardware integration and OS integration in this way.
So do you also have to consider or worry about privacy or security as much as the ASR engine or the NLP engine needs to?
Well, privacy and security of what is being said or how the voice is being used.
How the voice is being used, because like, for example, if you have a speech recognition system and I said something, it will interpret and then it needs to know my recording and then what I have said and all of those things. Now, when someone is using these assistive technologies, like the text to speech with the assistive technologies, of course, there's something they are doing. So how much should they be worried about, like, well, what's happening in that world?
Yeah, I mean, in the world of assistive technology, I don't think that that's as much of a concern because their devices their voice is embedded on their device, right? I think the concern might be like if somehow that voice got to somebody else's device and they were able to use that voice to do something else. There is some concern about as the voices become more and more realistic sounding, is there opportunity for the voices to spoof systems like voice authentication systems? And actually, we did some work along these lines in 2018 with some banks, with a major bank to see if our voices could penetrate through their systems. And we did find that even a couple generations back of our synthesis engine, we were able to penetrate through the authentication system. But there's multiple layers of voice authentication that probably would avoid that. And so I think the thing that we realized is that we have to start doing things to make sure that our voice isn't inadvertently used in different places for nefarious uses. And so we're looking into and we're working on a process of kind of watermarking. It's called audio steganography of the voices to make sure that they can't be misused in that way. We also actually built some technology to integrate into this kind of application, especially financial applications, to not only identify our voices, but identify different kinds of synthetic media, auditory synthetic media. Because you can, of course, make a voice with text to speech, but you can also make voices using speech to speech, so voice conversion and voice conversion as well. So I think that we have to start thinking about ethics and about misuse of our unintended misuse of our technology, as well as intended misuse of our technology ahead of time to sort of fight off some of this stuff proactively.
Yeah, that is so important because some of the things like we can think about when we are designing, like, oh, this could be a possible use case where people would misuse or intentionally or unintentionally. What about the scenarios where you don't even know, like, is there anything else someone can think? So, for example, companies hire ethical hackers to think like a hacker so that they are not actually compromising with the systems and they are actually helping design a more robust system. Do you see that in future, these voice technologies would also have similar kind of skill sets being used?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's kind of what we ended up, because of the foray with the financial industry. I think it was an awakening. We were on this path of making these voices, making them as accessible as possible, and for as many people as possible. I mean, then you realize, oh, damn, that could actually, even though it doesn't necessarily even sound that natural for the automated system, if they're automated gates, those are not ready for the new kinds of voices, and they are allowing these voices to get into someone's bank account or whatever it may be. Those are things you want to avoid, right? And so that kind of got us to be thinking about it. But of course, I think that we're a small company. I think over time, as this becomes more and more prevalent, I think you're definitely gonna see that. And I feel like although the bigger banks are probably kind of waiting for the fraud level to be high enough, because right now insurance can cover whatever, as fraud level goes up, and it will. And with any new technology, people always find a bad way to use it. Even if it's intended for good, there will be misuses of the technology. And so I think we can't be naive to say, oh no, we've got it covered. I think we do need to plan for this, whether it's hiring hackers, whether it's building in these newer methodologies to track the voices, whether it's creating registries. There are multiple different things that we have at our disposal, and to pretend that they're not going to happen is really, I think, irresponsible.
Yeah, definitely. I think there's so many opportunities, especially in this world where, like so many different skill sets could be leveraged in order to design a better solution for the users. So it's not that ethical hackers are only required in a software company for XYZ reason, or a psychologist is required only in like a medical field or something like that. So it's interesting to see how you are saying that psychologists, linguists, and hackers, and maybe machine learning, of course, data scientist is required for anything to do with AI. But then in addition to that, all of these different kind of skill sets which you're talking about. Now, if someone needs to design like text-to-speech engine or for their own use, how do they actually go about it? Like, do they use your tool to do that thing, or could you walk us through the process?
Sure. So I'll take the example of maybe like a small business that wants to create a unique voice. So what they would do is they would reach out to us. We would create an account for them where their talent. So they have to have, whether it's like, maybe it's like, if it's a mom and pop store, maybe it's like someone who is one of the owners or whatever, but there's somebody whose voice it's going to emulate, right? So that person records their audio on our platform. So we have a platform where it's kind of like a teleprompting site where it will give you the content to read aloud, and then you read it aloud on that. And it's all done, it can be done within a home. Like, you don't have to go to a studio to do this. You do have to have a good microphone and also a quiet room to record in. We also ask that the room is not reverberant so that it's not very echoey sounding. But all the content is provided by us. In some cases, though, we typically, like if we have a particular use case, we might actually ask for content that is going to be like that use case. So for example, we recently made a voice for a bank, right? And what we were doing for them is we took the kind of content they would say in that customer support line and use that as part of the content that the individual read out loud. The reason is because the phrasing and the cadence is really important to get right, not just the words that are being said. That takes people to get about 90 minutes of audio. It might take about 3 or 4 hours to record, because sometimes you re-record and you're reading and listening and then recording and so on. Once that's done, we then take that audio. We have a QA process within to align the audio that's being said with the content that we told them to read out loud. So we kind of clean up the audio, including de-reverberation, mouse click removal, all the stuff that we have to do to kind of clean up the audio. And then we build the voice engine. Usually takes us about somewhere between a week to 10 days for that whole process, from cleaning up the audio to training the audio to training the voice model. In some cases, we often have to make a second model. The model training can take 2 to 3 days of just computation time. And then there's a lot of hyperparameter tuning that is happening on our end as well to kind of get that voice to sound accurate. So within a few weeks, 2 to 3 weeks, you'd have, if the person records with, let's say in a week, we take another a week to 10 days to kind of build the voice. In less than a month, you can have a voice that is customized to your needs.
That's amazing. Like from 2 years, it's like a month.
Yeah.
have a voice, which is really fascinating. So there are so many other text-to-speech companies out there who are providing similar natural sounding synthetic voices, right? What is different about VocaliD when it comes to anything, the text-to-speech itself or the process you follow, the timeline? What is it which stands you out?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think it's exciting now that we have a lot more competition in the area. It just talks about sort of market validation that there is something here. I think that the differentiator for us is that when we started, we had a very difficult sort of challenge to make these voices with very little data. So we've perfected in many ways the content that needs to be said out loud in order to create these voices. We're now on this generation 5 of the synthesis engine where a lot of this stuff now is open source code, right? And so you do have new companies just sprouting out saying, okay, I'll take this off of GitHub and I'm gonna, implement this algorithm. And that's all fine when the data is nice and clean. One thing that we have is a lot of experience from 5 years of work and plus more to understand that how to get the data in the right format and how to clean that data so that it will produce a good sounding voice, not just from a clean data set, but from new data sets that happen. So I think our thing is we're most focused on customized new voices, as opposed to a lot of these companies have sort of a library of voices that they have built out and then are using and are selling those voices. Some of them also do offer custom voices, but I think we've got a lot of training in doing this over the years. So it's the know-how of what data is supposed to be used, how to clean that data. Additionally, because we have this large database of data, we can also create these universal models of voice that are very different than if you only are using existing data sets. So we have data, we have know-how, and we have got experience not just in machine learning, but also in speech. So I think the machine learning, I want to say this again, is like, it's going to get you 80 to 90% of the way there. That's great. But it's that last mile, that last little bit that requires an understanding of speech and of speech production and the auditory signal. So we have audio engineers in our team because we believe that that's really where the magic is going to happen.
Yeah, it's a teamwork, definitely not one person's job for sure. So nowadays we also have been hearing more emotive voices where you can actually create your text-to-speech engine to be more emotive in a sense like apologetic or empathetic and all of these kind of things. If you have to create that level of emotions, you mentioned that you need to record all of these things, right? And there is like scripts which people will use and read out loud, right? But in order to get that level of like emotions, like, oh, I'm really sorry. Or when we are talking, like you mentioned, when you are talking, it is different than when you are reading something out, right?
Yeah.
What challenges do you see there to get to that emotive levels?
Yeah, I think there's a lot. And I think also when we're talking about emotive levels today, we're really talking about sort of caricaturized emotions. So kind of almost like saying, well, if it's going to be, somehow empathetic, right? What is empathetic is going to be like sort of like a sad and somehow like you're going to feel like it's listening to you, right? But how much of that is top down saying, oh, the signal is changed in this way in order to be empathetic versus actually based on listener perception of empathy. And we know that that varies, right? So part of what we're trying to do with these listener experiments is to really try to understand what are the acoustic correlates of empathy. And if you play people, let's say 100 different samples of voices, right? Which ones are most empathetic? And then looking at the acoustic characteristics rather than this top-down process. So we're really thinking about it as rather than just going by theory of what is empathetic, we really want to base it on how are people perceiving empathy, right? And I think that that's going to be a constant feedback loop, right? You're not only going to have information that in theory in textbooks that we can say, because we don't want to caricaturize it. We want to make it situationally dependent. Empathy is very different when you're talking about something like consoling someone versus agreeing with someone around a topic that maybe doesn't have that kind of weighty emotion to it, right? So when we caricaturize emotions too much, I think we run the risk of it being not authentic sounding and not genuine sounding. And I think that that's what I feel is the biggest challenge here, is that typically when we thought about emotions, because it's such a hard thing, even if you think about emotion, like detecting emotions, people use these 5 broad categories, right? But we know it's not, we don't just have 5 broad categories of emotions. It's a nice, neat way of analyzing the world of emotion, but emotion is messy, all right? And to pretend it's not messy is to say that, is sort of fooling yourself to imagine that it's, oh, it's nice and neat like this, and we're gonna have these nice categories. So I think that is the holy grail of, thinking about voice, but I don't think we can only kind of go top down. I think we have to do sort of a combination of both.
Wow. This is such a fascinating topic. I can talk to you hours and hours about this thing. Yeah. So what advice would you give anyone wanting to get into the space? What should they be reading, listening to, and doing?
I think one piece of advice I'd give, and it's not technical, it's actually start to be more observant about your interactions with people. Listen to audio that's out there that you find pleasurable or interesting. Make notes of that. And I think that you'll have a better understanding of what communication, like good communication and authentic and real natural interactions feel like. And I think if you're coming from data-based inquiry like that, I think they'll have a lot to contribute to the next phase of this technology. I think the technology has developed, but now we have to start to think about new ways to add the science of listener perception and of voice theory into these new products and services.
I like that. Yeah, definitely. We keep telling people, like, if you want to learn something, experiment that thing, like deep down, try to analyze it. Even with the voice applications, I keep suggesting people like, okay, look at the experiences and see what's going wrong and what you can improve. So that's pretty much the same thing, like analyze the different audios and sounds and how it sounds and all of those kind of things, which is great. Rupal, if someone wants to get in touch with you or learn more about you, where can they do that?
Yeah, they can go to vocalid.ai, and if they're interested in specifically kind of contributing their voice or learning more about that, they can go to vocalid.ai / Voicebank. If they're interested in a voice, they can also reach out Rupal at vocalid.ai.
Awesome. Yeah, I'll make sure we add it into the show notes. Thank you so much for your time today. It was wonderful talking with you.
It was great talking to you too. Take care.
Thanks for listening today. If you would like to post a voice comment, please go to www.witlingo.com/daa. That's www.witlingo.com/daa. We'd love to hear from you. Remember, you can find all the information on becoming a certified voice interaction designer, along with show notes and more at our website, digitalassistant.academy. That's digitalassistant.academy. We encourage your feedback and questions. Be sure to get in touch by using the contact page at the Digital Assistant Academy's website. We will include the link in the show notes. In our next episode, Elaine Lee, Principal Product Designer at Twilio, talks about designing trustworthy voice assistants.